Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with our host, Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
WCAT Radio presents Just Plain Theology from Rome, Sweet Rome, featuring Natalia Yuzian, who was on location in Rome as a student. And today we have with us, waiting to make connections with Rome now with Natalia, we have with us Dr. Sebastian Mahfood. And Sebastian agreed to talk about his last time in Rome, and we can get some insights as to what Rome is like. I've never been there myself, but I'd like to go sometime. I had some opportunities, but they just didn't work out. So, Sebastian?
Well, hello, Bob. Thank you for having me on the program.
So what about your trips to Rome? You've probably made more than one, right?
Well, you know, I was in the United States Peace Corps for 2 years, and I was stationed in a place called Tunisia. And Tunisia is just south of Italy. And,
I'm getting a little echo on there, by the way. I'm getting a little echo on there.
Are you? Okay, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can
all right.
do something about that.
So, Sebastian was in the Peace Corps.
How about now? Are you still receiving the echo?
Yes.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me do this. What I'll do is I'll call in with my other phone.
All right, good.
And that'll get us on. But in the meantime,
I think maybe we may have a problem with Natalia today because of daylight saving time. And she may not have been aware of the fact that the U.S. started on daylight saving time this week, so it makes a difference of an hour. So we're hoping that Dr. Sebastian has sent her an email, and maybe she will be coming on here shortly. Next week, Natalia said that she's going to have a guest, Father Glenn Breed, who's a graduate of Holy Apostles College in Cromwell, Connecticut, and he is going to talk about end-of-life issues. So, Dr. Sebastian, you were starting to tell us about your Peace Corps activity in Rome.
Yeah, I was. Can you hear me without the echo now?
Yes.
Okay, so it was just changing the phone. So for 2 years, I lived in the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. I lived in a small town called Kairouan, a small town being about 100,000 people, and also a small town being about 180 mosques that I was surrounded by during my time there. So the landscape, culturally and religiously, had changed somewhat since the time the Romans abandoned or left North Africa. Tunisia is also the site of Carthage, and you may remember from your history the Punic Wars, where Rome came down and destroyed Carthage after the Third Punic War and salted the earth so that nothing could grow there again, which I think was a rather short-sighted of them, considering how much they were able to make use of North Africa for their grain purposes, and feeding purposes for the people. But so that's where I lived for 2 years, and I had the opportunity at one point to travel to Italy. And so that's the story I can now tell. Hold on one second.
By the way, we were just talking about that a few weeks ago in the liturgy, about how that was a tactic that they used in those days, is salting the earth so that nothing would grow there.
Oh, right, right.
Destroyed the land.
Right, and
seems like it was just a month or so ago.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Romans and the North Africans were not the best of friends, and there's the old legend or the story that Aeneas, when he was coming from Troy, landed in Carthage and met Queen Dido, and Queen Dido fell in love with him and asked him to stay, but he said, "No, I'm on a destiny. I'm on a mission from God. I have to found an empire that will rule the earth." And so he sails across the Mediterranean and lands in Italy. And then the rest is history. His descendants, Romulus and Remus, end up founding Rome in the Seven Hills. But Dido kills herself. She throws herself into a funeral pyre, just so distraught as she is at the loss of Aeneas. And from then on, that established the ancient enmity between the Roman Empire, what would become the Roman Empire, and the Phoenician Empire in Carthage in North Africa, or at least one of its colonies. Carthage is also the site, if you're familiar with Catholic saint history, hagiography, it's also the site of where Felicity and Perpetua were martyred in the 2nd century. And Tertullian has assembled the autobiography or the last days, the diary of Saint Felicity. And it's an interesting read in the sense that you've got this woman who's just given birth, whose father and husband are begging her to sprinkle salt on or incense on the fires of the Roman gods. And she says, "No, I won't. I must worship the one true God." And they say, "Well, what about your baby? Your baby will need you." And she says that she must still obey God and not man. And so she allows herself to be thrown to the wild beast with Perpetua. So it's an interesting backdrop to our Catholic heritage, the entire North African scene, but in particular the Carthage area, or the area of Carthage. So I was in and out of that place my entire 2 years that I was there. Kairouan is about 2 hours south of Carthage, and it had its own ruins left over from the Roman times. But a new civilization had sprung up in the meantime. And as much as this new civilization had made its mark on North Africa, it had not yet wiped away the remains of the Romans. There were still shards of Roman pottery. There were rooftops that were buried under the ground that if you went to a certain field, you could see them sticking out of the ground. In the Tunisian Antiquities Commission, in the Bardo Museum in Tunis, were preserving them, as memories of their ancient heritage. So it was very nice place to be in terms of historical archaeology, in terms of the art of the period. And then if you went just a little further north, if you got on a ferry and went up to Sicily to a place called Agrigento, you could see whole buildings that were still fairly well preserved from Roman times. So the Roman influence is all over the area where I lived for 2 years. And so when Natalia tells these stories about living in Rome and about her time living among the Romans, I just know how incredibly special and great that experience is because of the connection to our past, in terms of how the Roman Empire shaped that part of the world and was thereby a suitable vessel, for how Christianity would take over and reshape the world in its image. using the communication channels, using the civilization, the roads, all those things that God had laid out beforehand, so that when Christianity came, it would have a way to make itself known to the entire world. So Rome, in my mind, is sort of a great megaphone that God put in place to announce the coming of Christ. In spite of the persecutions, but in many cases because of them. Because as we know from our martyrology, the blood of the martyrs became the seeds of the church.
That's right.
Yeah.
So were you pretty well up on your history when you went there?
I had studied Latin, and I read, all that material they had us translate in school about the exploits of Scipio Africanus and Hannibal, and Caesar's Gallic Wars, and things like that. So I was familiar with the Mediterranean, its importance in the life of the Roman Empire, with the history and culture of Rome. All of that from my Latin classes. And if anybody listening to this program has not yet studied Latin, it is the key to who we are today. Not only in terms of the history of the Roman Empire and of the Latin-speaking world, and of the Church, which today you can still take ecclesiastical Latin and you can learn how to read all these wonderful documents that were written in Latin up until quite recently. But it's also an opportunity to understand more about who you are as an English-speaking person. 52% of the English language I learned during my time in Latin studies. 52% of the English language is comprised of Latin. So just take most of half your words and look at their Latin roots, and you'll find them. And people who study Latin get better scores on SATs, on GREs, on any kind of standardized exam that asks them to critically evaluate the language they speak. So in that sense, yes, I was familiar with the history. I wasn't nearly as familiar with it then, when I was only 22 at the time that I left, as I became in the years that followed. My time in North Africa was a great learning experience for me. And then in my studies after my return, as I pursued my doctorate and my work in philosophy and theology, those provided me with greater insights into that world. But I know that one could study that world for one's whole life and never exhaust the materials that can be found within it.
Is Latin still? Is it still being taught in the schools now?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you can learn Latin in as early as high school. When I first encountered it was 9th grade.
So that's not one of the things that's disappeared, huh?
No, fortunately not. And of course, during our Lenten season now, the Church brings out all its best Latin. So you hear people in Mass doing Latin chanting. It's great to hear that the language that helped establish us, Western civilization, also because of the Church, that language is still very much present in our liturgies and in our daily lives, in terms of the opportunities we have to study it, and in terms of the use or the residual presence it still has in the English language. So, if you want, I can tell you about my time in Rome.
You said that you went into the Peace Corps when you were 22?
Yeah, I was 22 years old. I just finished my first master's degree in English literature, comparative literature. And I entered the Peace Corps.
You just ended that? You got your master's degree before you went in the Peace Corps?
I did, yeah. I was younger than most of my friends. I finished my master's in comparative literature by age 22. And my father was a radio talk show host, and he interviewed a person from the Peace Corps who was a recruiter. And at the end of the show, the recruiter said to him, "And if you know anybody who would like to join the Peace Corps and go out into the world and get life experience and learn a language and embrace another culture, if you know anybody like that, just send them our way." And I remember my dad's show ended at noon. I got a call at 12:02.
Wow.
He said, "Listen, I got a deal for you." And he told me all about the program and who he had on it, and it was intriguing enough for me to pursue it. But back then, in 1990,
it was your dad's idea to start with, huh?
Yeah. Well, he was the one who interviewed the Peace Corps recruiter.
Yeah.
But I had talked to him just recently, or a week before that, and I had said, "Dad, I want you to be thinking about something. I'm about to get my master's in comparative literature at age 22. I've got a choice. I can try to find a job teaching somewhere, but at only 22, I'm not certain that I'll be able to find one. Or I can jump into a PhD program, at which point I'll have another problem in a few years, because I'll be 24 or 25 with my doctorate.
Wow.
There should be something I can do to either be gainfully employed or to pass the time while I'm looking for something." And he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I would like to teach." He said, "Okay." So when this Peace Corps recruiter told him that they had jobs in the Peace Corps where people could be university professors as long as they had at least a master's in English, that's what got him on the phone with me, because
wow,
that was my degree, Master of Arts in English. Well, with the emphasis in comparative literature. So that was quick. This was the days before the internet, too. So I couldn't just jump online and research it. I had to actually physically call a Peace Corps recruiter and ask them to send me information, which came by mail. So it took several days for me to lay out a plan. But that was, I think, April. No, that would have been sooner. That would have probably been February of 1994, and I was in North Africa by June of 1994. So the entire process only took 4 months from start to finish. I was amazed at how quick it was, actually. And in retrospect, the entire recruitment process went rather quickly. You know, from the time that I was standing in Arlington, Texas, to the time that I was standing in Minzel Jamil, Tunisia, in North Africa.
Yeah, that's amazing. You know, a few years ago, when I think Keyes was running for president.
Sure.
What's his first name again?
Keyes, Alan?
Alan Keyes, yeah.
Yeah.
Alan Keyes was in Kalamazoo, and I took a trip down there because I wanted to hear him talk. And I met this homeschool lad, and he was 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And he had just come back from Russia, where he spent a year teaching English.
Oh, wow. So was he on a similar kind of program?
Well, it wasn't a Peace Corps, no. I don't know what the program was, but he had just come back. I think he was there a year. And then he was going to go online and become a lawyer.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
With one of those Christian law organizations, I think Thomas More or one of those.
Right.
16 years old. And that's the advantage of course, homeschooling too, because you don't need all that time that's taken in high school to really get a degree.
Right. Well, I mean that's
to finish high school.
Right.
Finish high school. He finished high school in the I think he must have been 15. So, but that's what these fellows are talking about there in the who I interviewed a week ago, Pat Carmack.
Yeah, Pat Carmack, right, at the Angelicum Academy.
Yeah. And saying that, really someday there won't be any high school.
Well, it's all, the landscape, educational landscape is changing, and so he was spot on with what he was saying. There are...
that was so interesting.
Yeah, there used to be a time when the industrial method of education made sense. You get 25 students in a classroom in seats of 5 by 5. They move around by whenever a bell tells them to get up and walk to the next classroom.
Right.
And they learn a curriculum that's been pre-established for them by the Department of Education. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the Department of Education and accrediting bodies started shifting from resource-based assessment structures to outcomes-based assessment structures.
Oh, yes, I remember that when that started.
Yeah, I mean, people had to readjust. They had to establish learning outcomes for their courses, for their programs, and then they had to be able to demonstrate that what they were doing in the classroom was meeting those learning outcomes. And so everything became, are you meeting the learning outcomes you've set for yourself? Well, once that happened, the importance of seat time in a classroom, which is really a resource-based kind of approach to education, became much less meaningful than whether or not a student could demonstrate that he or she had met the outcomes that the institution was requiring. So somebody who could meet X, Y, and Z outcome didn't necessarily have to sit for a year learning X, Y, and Z outcome, in order to pass the time in a classroom.
So you thought that was good, huh?
Well, I thought the transition to outcomes-based assessment posed opportunities for us that we didn't have before. But I mean, you still see residual resource-based assessment structures, peering out. So, for instance, in our field of theological education, the Association of Theological Schools still had a great many resource-based requirements for students who wanted to pursue degrees in theology, the greatest of which was seat time. They needed residency in all of their in all of the programs. So somebody who was going to pursue a degree in theology would need to be in residence for a certain amount of time in that degree program. And right after 2012, or during the biennial meeting in 2012, the Association of Theological Schools did what other accrediting bodies had already done. It said, okay, well, these degrees can be pursued, at least academic degrees, 100% online. And then within a year, they granted exceptions to 3 schools to pursue Master of Divinity degrees, 100% online. So the world of being able to demonstrate that you're meeting the outcomes started to break through that world of you have to have a certain amount of time in your seat in order for your coursework or your program to have any real meaning. And nowadays, with this Angelicum program, the students who enter into the Angelicum in 9th grade will complete 75 credits by the time they get out of high school. And those 75 credits are college credits. So at age 17, conceivably, you could have a student graduating from high school and receiving upon graduation an Associate of Arts degree. So he's got his first college degree 1 foot out of high school. And then, since he only has 45 more credits to go to get his BA, 15 that summer, 15 that fall, and 15 that spring, and that student will have a Bachelor of Arts degree at age 18. So where to go from there? I mean, the sky's the limit, in terms of things that a person would be able to do. They'd be able to demonstrate a certain set of competencies that would make them employable in the real world. So the only question remains in what way can we support 18-year-old graduates with Bachelor of Arts degrees in pursuing work or in pursuing graduate school or whatever it is they want to do upon graduation. My solution was to go off to the Peace Corps and live for 2 years in North Africa. I came back, I was 24. I was the same age as all of my high school friends who were just getting their bachelor's degrees. And, by 96, many of them had caught up with me and gotten their master's degrees, but without the 2 years foreign service experience. So that really gave me a leg up in the world to be able to return and say, I've been an assistant professor for 2 years in North Africa in full-time university work, at age 22.
But I think if I remember correctly, back then when they started the outcome-based education,
sure.
It just seemed to me I had a problem with who was setting the outcome.
Oh, well, yeah, so that's the conversation, right? If we have a reasonable people setting the outcomes based on practical standards, practical needs, then sure, no problem with it. But if you've got a liberal ideology establishing outcomes that don't really correspond to
I think there was a lot of that, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, well, you remember the whole PC movement, political correctness. That was the difficulty with some learning outcomes. So it wasn't that that you could do X, Y, or Z, but that you had been exposed to A, B, and C culturally or politically or whatever. So had it been more, had the learning outcomes been more practically oriented toward real-world needs?
Yes.
Of course, you're going to have any number of people who might be listening to this broadcast would say, well, multicultural awareness is a real-world need. And I would say, well, sure, but, if you had hit it not at the point of multicultural awareness, but at the point of intercultural competencies, you would have been closer to your mark, in terms of what it is that you wanted people to be able to do when they got out.
But the idea was exceptional, right? The outcome-based idea was just what we needed, huh?
Yeah, I think outcomes-based, because otherwise, before with the resource-based methods, if a school had a certain number of faculty, if a school had a certain number of books in its library, if a school had a certain number of programs or courses on its docket, then people would say, okay, it's a good school. But if the school was producing students or graduates who could not perform, and that's part of where these outcomes-based assessment started to come from, we started to have an increasing number of students graduating from college with a large or high debt load. And when they would get out of college, they would have degrees, but they wouldn't be able to repay their debts, their student loan debts, or they wouldn't be able to find employment within their area because they hadn't accomplished, perhaps, the kinds of goals that, the workforce needed or whatever. Mm-hmm. So outcomes-based assessment simply said, it's not enough for you to have all these things. We actually want results in the real world when students graduate. And we want those results to be provable during their time in the program, demonstrable through your assessment structures. Simply lay out some outcomes for your programs and then develop viable means by which to assess whether or not those programs are working. And so that was the idea behind outcomes-based assessment, was that people would be able to demonstrate that they were meeting what it was that they said that they were going to meet. So that was great. That idea is good. The politicization in the ideologization, can I make that a word, of the entire process.
Is that a word?
Oh, yeah, I think I just coined it. But that's, I think, what caused our problems, in the as we were transitioning into this new way of assessing the viability
that's the sense
of our
I
programs.
had anyway. But who was it that was there a founder, or was there a group of people who came up with this, or what? Was anyone?
Oh, I don't know.
Get the credit for that?
Yeah, I don't know anything beyond the Department of Education, whether or not there was a group or a team or whomever who might have come up with that.
But that's who brought it out, is the Department of Education.
Yeah, Department of Education, and it would have happened in the late '80s. So
yeah, I remember well when it happened.
Yeah, so sometime under the Reagan or Bush administration, or at least the first Bush administration, George the father. But then in '92, the Clinton administration would have gotten hold of it, and where it would have gone from there would have been the history of the world of assessment. So I don't know. It's probably an interesting study to get into the exact the political reasons why it came about. More than
but
practical.
It's being used correctly now in the church, right?
Well, at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, yes. And I imagine at the other Cardinal Newman approved schools as well, and in the seminaries around the country. The accreditation or accrediting body that governs Holy Apostles is the New England Association of Schools and Colleges. And they are a regional accrediting body, which means they don't have any specific religious, undertones or affiliations or whatnot. So the accrediting body that Holy Apostles is pursuing, in addition to maintaining its New England Association accreditation, is the Association of Theological Schools, because they understand theology on the graduate level, graduate level theology, and have been accrediting theological schools for a very long time. In the Association of Theological Schools, there are three divisions. There are evangelicals, there are mainline Protestants, and there are Roman Catholics, at least in terms of the largest numbers. Of the Roman Catholic schools, there are 40 of them that are accredited by ATS, and one of them, Holy Apostles, is in candidacy and will likely receive its full accreditation in June. But those outcomes-based standards are mapped onto at least the needs of theological education. What we do as Catholics, we add, because we're seminaries, that also engage in the work of priestly formation in order to prepare seminarians or candidates for the priesthood for ordination by their bishops. We also have something called the Program of Priestly Formation from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is the fifth edition, which is about to go into sixth edition in the next year or so. And the Program of Priestly Formation provides us with some very useful outcomes and means by which of engaging in formation. So by bringing these two associations together, by bringing the PPF, the Program of Priestly Formation, together with the Association of Theological School guidelines, we've been able to put together a viable outcomes-based assessment structure that works for the needs of the church. In fact, I was one of the co-authors of it. Monsignor Jeremiah McCarthy, and Father Mark Lakovich, who's over in Cleveland. He's the president rector of the Cleveland, the seminary out there, St. Mary's in Wycliffe. The three of us put together an assessment handbook, an assessment guidebook that brought. Oh, hold on one second. My cat just threw up on the floor, and my dog tried to investigate. So I just separated this. So let me start over. So this is one of the hazards of working out of a home office. 1,000 1,000 miles away from my school office, is the animals in the house continue, and they're always up to their own activities, and they occasionally involve me in the maintenance of their schedules. So the assessment handbook that we put together uses the ATS guidelines for the Association of Theological Schools, and it uses the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Program of Priestly Formation. And what we did was we established within the handbook guidelines that we then piloted to 12 schools. And so 3 of the schools piloted the spiritual formation guidelines, 3 of them the pastoral formation guidelines, 3 of them the human formation guidelines, and 3 of them the intellectual formation guidelines. And by bringing these 12 schools together in that way, we came up with 12 very good models, or 3 very good models for each of these 4 dimensions of the program of priestly formation: human, pastoral, spiritual, and intellectual, that will assist all Catholic seminaries in the country, and even the Protestant, mainline Protestant evangelical seminaries, since ATS is now publishing it on their website for general use.
That's exciting.
Oh, it's very exciting. Very.
Yes.
At least in terms of what the future is for outcomes-based assessment within the theological tradition, that we advance within our schools.
Well, I'm glad you brought this out, because it's given me a whole different outlook now on outcome-based education. I did have a very good opinion of it,
Well, sure. Well, here's a simple. Right. I was going to say, here's a simple outcome. Can a man preach a homily? Yes or no? Yeah. So what does it mean for somebody to be able to preach a homily? Right. Well, that's an outcome that every parishioner, every time somebody goes to Mass, they're able to determine, this man can or cannot preach. One, if he can preach, he's got X, Y, and Z qualities, and those are actually coming through. I mean, everybody knows what a good homily sounds like when they hear it. Mm-hmm. At least they know what it sounds like to them.
Right.
So, to be able to use some of these methods that have been given to us, and remember, all technologies are gifts from Christ, and all methods are technologies. They're ways in which to go about doing things. If we can put these in service to the Church in a meaningful way, we're going to have people who can engage more intentionally in the work that they are called to do in their vocational lives. And that's where I see the future of outcomes-based assessment, at least in terms of my own work as a seminary administrator, as a college administrator at a Catholic school.
And, it's obvious that you really did a lot of work and to come up with the right outcomes.
Well, yeah, it's been it's not just me. This is a product of.
I know. That's what I mean. But the way you explained it.
Right. It's a product of a lot of people working in a lot of meaningful ways. Yeah.
But like I say, my whole problem was with the outcomes that were established by the National Education Association.
Yeah, right, and those were in many cases outcomes that had a political agenda behind them. They had some kind of ideology that was driving them. Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to your Peace Corps days, and how did that work out then? You were quite excited to go, right?
Oh, I was very excited to go. I remember when I got the letter saying that I had been accepted, my first choice was actually Albania, because I had heard, one, it was on the Adriatic, so it was a coastal country, and I had heard that it had a very unique history. It had been, by the early 90s, it was trying to reclaim its identity. It had suffered under a communist dictator named Enver Hoxha, if I'm pronouncing that right, for many years following World War II, many decades. And one of the things that Hoxha tried to do, and was successful in doing, was eradicating the history of the Albanian people from their consciousness.
Wow.
So, I mean, he simply didn't teach the history. And Hoxha was politically sly, too. He was an ally of Tito in Yugoslavia, and following his break with Tito, he allied himself with Stalin, with the Soviet Union, and then following his break with the Soviet Union, he allied himself with China. So he kept finding protectors who were further and further away from his epicenter. And that was very strategic on his part. You know, the Chinese wanted a port city. He said, no problem. Give us money and give us this kind of protection and so on and so forth. You can have it. And they
oh, my goodness.
Yeah, they didn't interfere nearly as much in his internal affairs as, say, the Yugoslavians did under Tito. So I thought it was an interesting enough country to visit. And back in 1992, when I was trying to decide where I wanted to go, and I knew it had to be Mediterranean. That was my first choice. But where in the Mediterranean was still up for grabs. I watched an episode of Cheers. You know, do you remember Coach on Cheers?
Oh, yeah.
So at one point, Coach is trying to help, I forget who, Woody or somebody, pass a test. And he comes up with a song, Albania, Albania, you border on the Adriatic. I don't know if you remember that particular
I don't
episode.
remember that song, though.
But it was just, but that had stuck in my mind. So they said, okay, we have Albania. I said, oh, well, I just heard that on Cheers, so maybe that's God's way of telling me that's where I need to be. And then I got a letter from the Peace Corps that said, okay, we may have Albania open in the next year. So that'll be, I think it was March at that point of 1994. So they said probably by 1995. They said, or, if you want, we have Tunisia open right now. So Tunisia, I trying to think, what is Tunisia? Where is it located? And so on and so forth, because I couldn't visualize it on a map. And so I reached over, grabbed my globe, spun the globe to the Mediterranean, and put my finger almost instantly on it. And I said, that's close enough to Rome. That's close enough. That's in the center of the world. And then all of my Latin history came back to me in terms of Carthage. I said, I know where this is. This is Carthage. And that's where I'm going. And so I called them, and I agreed that day that I received the letter. I said, sign me up. And the next thing I know, I started receiving all of my paperwork. I went and did my meds. I went through all the background checks they require of you, and they put me on a plane. They sent me a ticket. I got on a plane, and I landed in Philadelphia. And I met, on that day in Philadelphia, somebody very special who would become my wife. So we were in the Peace Corps together for 2 years. She was Asian. Yes. You never know who you're going to meet, you know, when you say yes
so you
to
met
God.
her in Philadelphia as you were getting ready to fly to Tunisia.
Yeah, she was in the group, in the Peace Corps group.
Wow.
Now, when we first met each other, we weren't attracted to one another. You know, we were just we looked at the other person and said, "Oh, that's a nice person." But you know how 2 years of containment in a foreign country will bring people close together.
Yes.
So over the course of those 2 years, there were only the United States government had decided to discontinue the Peace Corps program in Tunis in 95, so there were no new Peace Corps volunteers coming after our first year there. And so by the time we ended our tour, there were only like 30, 35 Americans left in the country, you know, who were Peace Corps volunteers. So she and I were among them, and we said, you know, it wouldn't be a bad idea for us to visit one another in the United States. And the rest is history.
Wow.
But
so what was the Peace Corps like?
Well, the Peace Corps was, we used to laugh about it. We used to say it was the toughest job you'll never do. And the reason for that is it's very difficult sometimes to move or to progress through another country's bureaucracy. And so at one point, during our time there. I mean, we would spend weeks just getting our living permits. You know, they call them carte séjours, our living cards, which were national identity cards. So if anybody saw us, we could turn them in. If we were traveling to another village or another site during our time over there, and we were going to spend the night at that other site, we had to check in with the local constabulary. And we would hand them our cards. They would register us as visitors in the town that night. And then we could stay the night, and the next morning we could leave without checking out because we had told them how long we would be there. So I taught at the university in Kairouan in central Tunisia, and I arranged my schedule, not my first year because I was new there and I didn't know what I was doing, but by the second year I got the schedule arranged so that I was only teaching Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And I was able to really engage in what they called the 3 goals of Peace Corps. The first goal was the job you were actually put there to do. The second goal was in case you could not do the job you were actually put there to do. And the second goal was to be an ambassador for the United States among the people, and to let people, to get to know the people, to get to know their language, but to let the people get to know you as an American citizen. And I was great at that. That was socializing. So we all went over there. We spent 10 weeks learning the language, and then they dropped us in a village for 2 years, in my case, the city of Kairouan. And my Arabic became good enough for me to be able to strike up casual conversations, tell jokes, engage people in what it is that they're doing in their lives, and so on. So I mean, I was fluent in street Arabic. I believe Natalia just showed up. Natalia!
Hey guys.
You're on the air.
I am.
We experienced a phenomenon yesterday, Sunday, at 2 a.m., called the annual Leaping Forward.
Oh,
so,
daylight saving time.
It's actually an hour later. So you're here 10 minutes early for a 2 o'clock show, but it is actually close to 3 o'clock.
Oh, dear.
That's all right. I forgot to write you. It didn't even cross my mind that this would be a problem today.
Well, we have this time. You know, we don't change until for another, until the 26th. So we're late.
I pointed that out to Bob. I said, Bob, when you weren't here right at 2, I said, Bob, she's not here. Why don't you just interview me? Because I can tell you about my time in Rome. And Bob said, okay. But guess what we've been talking about for the past 50 minutes? Everything but Rome.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm sorry I missed it. So what have you been talking about?
Well, Bob, you want to give a recap?
Well, one thing we talked quite a bit about was outcome-based education. I don't know how familiar you are with that, Natalia. But
not very.
It came in the 80s. I don't know if you remember that when it first came in.
I don't think Natalia was born in the 80s.
Oh, that is very kind of you. We'll just leave it at that.
But I was telling him that I had a big problem with it because outcome-based education came from the National Education Association. Is that the correct name?
Yeah, National. It came from the Department of Education.
I didn't have any problem with the program, like the outcome-based, but I had a lot of problem with the outcomes that they were proposing.
Right. Yeah. So the outcomes back in the late 80s and early 90s were very much liberal ideology that tried to advance certain liberal social agendas.
In public education.
Right.
Yeah.
But I was telling Bob, if any liberals are listening to the show, they might say, well, no, you're being unfair. But I know that's just the impression that I had, and that possibly that Bob also had. So.
Yes.
In what specifically would you cite, Bob? Are you talking about bringing in sex education to the schools where now it's something that would normally have been in the hands of the parents, or or a revision of textbooks and making that standardized?
Oh,
yeah, I don't remember.
Go ahead, Bob.
Tell her, Sebastian.
Well, I was just say the political correctness movement took over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the points I made to Bob earlier was there's nothing wrong with multicultural awareness courses, and ensuring that those things happen. But had they done something like intercultural competencies, that I think would have been closer to their mark of what it was that they were trying to accomplish. And they may have believed that the multicultural awareness agenda was a stepping stone toward the eventual pursuit of intercultural competencies. But it just seemed that they, at the time, they didn't give us any competencies. The outcome was to...
What do you mean about, well, when you say competencies, that I'm assuming that's a technical term in the field of education, or do you mean measuring what's done as opposed, what do you mean by that?
Well, skills that you can actually use in the real world. So an intercultural competency would be, I understand the difference between two cultures, but two, I have the ability to actually work within the other culture.
Yes, okay. So in other words, being able to take it that I'm late because I'm going by Italian time, and adjusting yourself accordingly.
Right. So exactly. So as soon as I realized that you were late because you were going by Italian time, I sent you an email. And at that point, I said, well, until she responds, because she's likely, this isn't even on her radar that she should be here at this time because of the daylight savings time change. Let me use my own competencies to maintain a conversation so that if we do have any listeners during this hour, and we probably have a few, that they will be sufficiently entertained. But in any case, but all that is good and well, and you can listen to the recording because I'll post the broadcast, and you'll have it on your own program, and I'll even give it a title, the day the clocks changed, or something like that.
There you go. Great.
But before we leave the outcome-based education,
sure.
Sebastian gave me a whole new outlook on it because it actually was a good thing, and it's being used marvelously within the church right now, Sebastian. Right?
Yeah, it is. And I'll post some of the documents that we're using, if you'd like to see them, Natalia, in terms of how the church is able to take outcomes-based assessment and kind of own it, kind of turn it into its own sort of thing. Because there is a good deal of use value in being able to demonstrate how what it is that you're doing in priestly formation is actually accomplishing what it is you want to be doing in priestly formation, for instance, and in Master of Arts in Theology programs and pastoral studies programs and things like that. So I was telling Bob, a couple of friends of mine and I wrote a book that was piloted with 12 U.S. seminaries that demonstrated an appropriate way to use outcomes-based assessment structures in the 4 dimensions of formation, intellectual, human, spiritual, and pastoral. And this book, following its being piloted in 12 seminaries, was then adopted by the Association of Theological Schools, which is going to put it on its website as a model not only for Catholic schools, but also for mainline Protestant and evangelical schools.
Okay. Yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah, but see, this just goes to show you. I was going to say, where there's adversity, even greater grace abounds.
Yes. Yeah. And it seems to me like it's very helpful for a distance learning, right? I mean, it's something that you can't get along without right now.
Right. Yeah, the assessment structures help us demonstrate that what it is that we're doing online is working. And the big thing in online learning when it first came out was to try to show that it's at least as good as face-to-face learning. And now the big challenge for face-to-face learning is to try to show that it's at least as good as online learning can be.
I don't know that everyone's on board with that assessment either. No. I'm just saying I've taken online courses that were extraordinarily effective, surprisingly, but that means that there's a lot of engagement on the part of the instructor, and building into that forced, if you will, engagement of the student, where you need to be present for online discussions and like that. And I found that course extremely effective. Others, if they just give you the materials and you go off and you read it, and okay, fine, you take a test. It's not the same, but you can have the same in the classroom setting as well. So. In the end, I think it's really up to the instructor and a good pedagogy on their part.
Well, that's what it is. It's all about a good pedagogy.
Right.
Because you can have very bad online experiences and very good ones, and you can have very bad on-campus experiences and very good ones. The question is, when we say what is bad and what is good, by what standard are we measuring those values? And that's where we can come up and say, okay, we've got these outcomes. Are we meeting the outcomes?
Right.
And are we meeting them well, or are we just squeaking by, or what are we doing?
Yeah. Well, listen, gang, we're kind of out of time.
Oh, too bad. That was getting interesting. I'm just getting warmed up.
Vacation. Are we going to give Natalia a vacation today?
We can. This can be the program. This can be the show, and she'll be the last 10 minutes of it.
And then you'll have Father Glenn on next week, Natalia.
That's the plan. Yes, indeed. And I've got I'm getting some other guests lined up here in Rome for some of March, probably first week of April, and then in May for sure. So that should be fun.
Okay.
But yeah, next week, Father Glenn.
Is that Father Glenn Breed? Our Father Glenn?
You got it.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. He'll be great.
Okay.
Okay. Well, in the 12 seconds we have left, I can tell you about my time in Rome. I was only there one day. I went to the Sistine Chapel and it was closed. There.
Oh, come back.
Yeah, I should. The day will come. Yeah.
The day will come. Right.
All right, Bob. That's it for us.
That's it, and we'll see you again next week. Natalia, you can figure out that time thing then, right?
We should be okay by next week.
Will you be changing your time there too? You said now.
On the 26th, we do. So
26th of March.
The 20. I'm sorry, not the 26th. Wait a minute. Hold on. What day is today? I'm in terrible shape. I don't even know what date it is. It's the 13th. No, I know that because it's my mother's birthday. But
12, 19, 26, yeah.
The 26th, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So maybe I'll miss the show that day. I don't know.
Well, you're not on Roman time.
We'll figure it out. Oh, Lord have mercy.
Well, you figure it out, Natalia.
We'll do.
I'm counting on you.
Okie dokie.
So this has been Rome, Sweet Rome with Natalia Yusian, and we'll be back next week, same time, same station. In the meantime, may God bless each and every one of you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.